a wonderful invitation. I think that this is such an important undertaking, the whole SufiCorner endeavor, but also, connected to that is the particular series that I understand is being inaugurated today. And sometimes when we think about spiritual traditions, we don't necessarily see a link between spirituality and intellectuality. So I thought that was a very fitting and intelligent way of framing this series, especially because a lot of the lectures, beginning with this one, they're going to emphasize the dual function of the heart and the intellect. Because normally we kind of live in a world where we're supposed to think that they're somehow different. And the intelligence has to do with ratiocination or some kind of like abstraction in the mind. Only scientists and biologists and astronomers and guys like that, they're allowed to do the thinking. So the people in religion, no, they're not allowed to do the thinking. They have this thing called the heart, and this is more like an emotional thing based on faith. And that kind of dualistic conception of the human being, number one, it's very alien to not just the Islamic intellectual tradition, but every major intellectual spiritual worldview before the modern period. That kind of bifurcation between subject and object, or between ways of knowing and ways of being, or modes of intellection, or levels of the heart. Every which way you conceive of it, it's just something that is quite characteristic of traditions before the 1800s. Now, of course, if we let the contemporary knowledge and forms thereof dictate our horizons, then we have very different understandings of what it means to be a person, or what it means to be a knowing person, what it means to be a feeling person, and ultimately what it means to live as a person in this world. So my task is a little bit complicated because I wrote this book. I spent about a decade writing it, and I'd like to be able to distill some of the things that are in it. But in order to really do a proper job there, I kind of need to lay out a few foundations. So that's what I will do today, is just speak about some of the foundational ideas and thinking that went into this book, why I think it's important, why I dedicated a decade of my life to doing it, and why I thought that it was the best way that I could dedicate those 10 years of my life to doing so. If it was just antiquated ideas about being and knowledge that were irrelevant today, then I'd be like, well, just a historian, right? But it's much more profound and a much more serious engagement was involved. As the poet says, to see this way as mere artifact in history obscures its lasting and profound mystery. By the way, I have a penchant for poetry, so sometimes I'll do this. Usually it's Persian, actually, but it depends on the way the muses are behaving. Today it seems to be a little bit of English poetry, I don't know. So I'm going to say a few things, just by way of just general comments about the nature of the intellect. What is the intellect? What is intelligence really all about? And then I'm going to maybe segue into some discussion about the heart and how the intelligence is related to the heart. And then I have a few questions for each of you. And then we're going to see if we can come up with some ways of thinking about how to access this thing called the heart. After all, the title of this book in question is called Inrushes of the Heart. So the heart has a very important role to play, but we need to really talk about what it is. Because you may have, let's say, fallen in love in this world, and you may have described yourself as having your heart taken away from you. So-and-so stole my heart away, for example, we say. Is that the heart that we're talking about? When the Quran speaks about the eyes not going blind, but it's the hearts of people that go blind. What is this heart? One verse actually in the Quran speaks about people who have قُلُوبٌ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ بِهَا. They have hearts with which they don't intellect. Isn't that interesting? The heart in that verse, it's related to the act of intellection. So something else seems to be at work here. And if we don't let contemporary forms of reasoning and ways of understanding what a human being is bake our cake, and we kind of follow the time-honored way of the wisdom traditions, we come up with very, very different answers to those questions, and then thereby also different answers to the meaning of life, the question of the meaning of life. So it really depends on where you put the seat of knowledge, knowing happens, that is to say, how it happens, and the question of its ability to transform a person. If we don't see knowledge as transformative, then it doesn't relate to our existence in any serious way. That's why a lot of people can like kind of know things, kind of just have it abstract, but it doesn't ever do anything to their bodies or to their souls. And sometimes they don't even need to even believe that they have a soul, but as long as they know certain things. That's a kind of mechanistic way of thinking of a human being. And for this, sometimes we'll bring in Rumi, because Rumi, even though he comes after the author that I wrote about here, ʿAyn al-Quḍāt, he often summarizes so well, as many of you know, many of these problems in pithy form. In fact, there's a verse right now with which I like to begin this inquiry. He says, "Aql juzvi, aql ra, badnam kar, kam dunya mard ra bikam kar." Are there any Persian knowers in the audience here? Okay, good. So I make a mistake, you don't let me know. So he says that the partial intelligence, it's given the capital I intelligence, or actual intelligence, a bad name. Bad non-kind, it's given it a bad name. The love, the desire for this world has made people desire less for the things of God. So he relates the partial intelligence with a very particular kind of cognitive ability within the human being that can answer specific things, but it can't answer the really big questions. Why? Because it's partial. It's not complete, right? But if we use that as the arbiter to know and to be, well, he's saying we're never going to be able to come up with complete answers because we're using a partial faculty. So he says that, and the reason we have that partial faculty is because we do need to be able to discern things in the world. And it works very well, this partial intelligence of ours, when we want to know, how to do mathematical operations, for example, or figure out the driving instructions to a place or whatever. But it doesn't work well at all when it comes to knowing universal things. And he's saying that this is another kind of intellect that needs to be activated here. And he calls it the capital I intellect. And the ingredient to activate that, he says, it's all about being able to detach yourself from the world. So later on we'll see some examples of the relationship between detachment from the world and this thing that the Buddhists call a heart practice. Heart practice. Which my guy ʿAyn al-Quḍāt also, he uses a very similar Persian term. He calls it heart action. Acting with your heart. It's really beautiful. I mean, how many of you are undergrads here? I've done degrees in the humanities or related fields. Have you ever heard of heart practice before? Yeah, afsus, what a shame. Isn't that unbelievable? I always tell it to my students. I say it's terrible that we learn about all these things, about what it means to be a human being, how to know, how to live. We never know about our hearts though. There's a very beautiful Confucian saying, because they place a great degree of emphasis upon the knowledge of the heart. It says that a human being, again, think of agrarian contexts 2,000 years ago in China, a human being has enough sense to go after his chickens and hens when he loses them, but he doesn't have enough sense to go after his heart when he loses it. Right? So we need to be able to, in a sense, figure out what this heart is all about, and then recover it, or uncover it, or in this case, probably discover it. You guys see the connection between the way why I'm saying it that way? There's discover, but when you say discover, you don't see what's really at stake here. It's just a discover, right? It's just to uncover something. It's there, we have it. It's just that it's been covered up a little bit. It's what the Quran refers to as a rust that's upon our hearts, right? Because of what we've done. So we'll move there eventually. Before I do that, there's another verse from Rumi that's coming through. And again, this one's about the heart directly. He says, Daftar Sufi saval do harf nist, juz dil speed hamchun barf nist, saz danishmand asar qalam, saz Sufi chist asar qadam. He says that the heart of the Sufi, of this person who walked that way and realized God, it's as white as snow, pure and white as snow. And that's the office of the Sufi. It's this white heart. That's where it gets its knowledge. But the traces of the scholar, they come from following what they learn through the pen. So it's through pen traces. That's how intellectuals today, at least, and in his time for sure, negotiate their space. It's through book learning, intellectual know-how. All from the partial intelligence, not the capital I intelligence. And he goes, but what are the Sufis' provisions? If the provisions of the scholar is ink, what are the Sufis' provisions? He says it's through following the footsteps of those who made it to God before them. So there's something else that's at stake here. There's something else that we need to be able to find the window into. It's not just book learning, right? There's something much more real, much more practical, actually. And the good news is, on one level, it doesn't even involve us. We're doing it, but somehow it's above us as well. And I promise that we'll get there too. So now my question, before I move on any further. Who here would venture to want to guess into what this heart that I'm speaking about might be? And how is it related to intelligence? Let's try the first question. We'll keep it interactive, huh? I don't want to be the only one talking here, right? I got 2 drinks here in front of me. You guys have none, so although you should help yourself, it's all back there. But let's keep it, let's keep it alive. Yes.
To answer your first question, what
yeah.
the heart is.
What is the heart, and maybe let's nuance it. What is the heart, and how do we access it?
I think the heart is like another way to interpret the soul or the consciousness. That's at least my understanding. I would love to hear your take on it, but that's my understanding of it. And to access it, I would say like the first step is really just to be sincere. I think that's like the only. There's no shortcutting that part of it. That's. But yeah, I'm trying to discover.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. So let me just repeat what you said and make sure I've understood properly. So you said that the heart, you kind of see it as a related to the human consciousness.
Yeah.
And that the way to access the heart is by sincerity.
Yes.
Okay, good. It's very interesting. The Arabic word that we would use for sincerity is ikhlas. Of course, many of you know it's in many Islamic languages. It has to do with something that's free from mixture, right? Ikhlas is something that's pure. Like in Arabic poetry, for example, it's used to speak about wine that's not mixed with water. That's known as it's khullas, right? The Quran speaks about الَّذِينَ أَخْلَصُوا دِينَهُمْ لِلَّهِ, those who make their faith pure or free of mixture for the sake of God. So sincerity is like kind of like it's like an explanation of what ikhlas is, but you'll see ikhlas is much more deep. Yes, it means to be sincere, but it means to not have any ulterior motives. It means to not be mixed up in your intentionality, right? To be totally for God and for the things of God. Yes?
So I like to think about the heart as the removal of everything from it that is an obstacle or it gets in the way. So kind of like what you're saying, like when we put the I or the me in it, that's the sullying in a sense, or it's the obstacle, or it's it kind of like the more of that comes in, then the less of the heart that can come through, because the heart is almost like divine, or it's almost like the breath of Allah in a sense, you could think. I don't know, like the thing that is, ultimately that makes everything meaningful, like that which we experience. So sometimes I think of it as like we're just fiber optic cables, and like, the emptier the cable, the more the laser or the beam can go through the beam, the more Allah. Like, I don't know, it's just like my crazy way of imagining things.
Yeah, good. So I mean, Rumi, and many authors like al-Quḍāt, they link directly the presence of God to the heart. Rumi goes so far as to even say that the heart is with him. No, the heart is him. And the reason the heart is identified with God at the highest level in Sufi metaphysics is precisely because it accords to human it accords to what we would call consciousness, right? So the root of human awareness and consciousness, they tell us, if we were to give it like a name, we'd call it the heart, right? Because it's this tool, as Henri Corbin said, of mystic physiology, right? It allows for a human being to see, but the principle of vision doesn't come from him; it actually comes through him, right? Okay, now, so let's shift our focus slightly and then loop back. So we kind of have an idea of what the heart is, right? It seems to be very central. Notice the symbolism too. Why of all the faculties in the human being, why would the heart be the symbol that emphasizes spiritual life, awareness, the principle of vision, and even consciousness more than any other such any other organ in the human body? And again, it's not just in Sufism, but in every different tradition you can think of. It's always the heart that's at stake. Why the heart?
Because it doesn't need anything else, just it is the source of the life in the human body.
Yes, without the heart.
Yeah, it supports everything else in the body.
Yeah, it's central.
Maybe along with it, it's
Yeah, good. Yeah. So right, good. You guys are good. This is you're making my job a whole lot easier, actually. So yeah, just like the physical heart, it's the basis of a human being's physical subsistence. So then, the spiritual heart is the basis of a human being's spiritual subsistence, right? This is very common. You see this across the board. So we've kind of spoken a little bit about what the heart is. Now, how do we access it? One individual over there, what's your name? Abdul said that it's the sari. Any other takers on how to access the heart? What other things could we be doing to access the heart?
The apple, reasoning, intellection.
Mm-hmm. So intelligence definitely has a role to play in the heart's human symbiosis, if you can, for lack of a better term. The capital I intellect, that is, not our partial intelligence. In fact, the partial intelligence does the opposite. It often pulls us away from being centered, right? And often what they say, as you guys might know, being interested in spirituality, is that there's this thing called meditation, or invocation, or prayer, all of which help kind of center a human being. Now, all of those kinds of functions, they represent the working of the intelligence in the human being at the fully operative level, not at a partial level. The partial intelligence says to itself, says to the human being who has it, why do I need to do any of this? Why can't I just go live my life? Look at the verse from Rumi. He says, love for the world, desire for the world. He used the word calm, like Kama Sutra, same word, calm. Real avaricious desire. That's what's clouding a human being's capital I intellect from flourishing, and there's always this very particular, distinctive, separative faculty that's at work. Now this part of the human being that's insisting on otherness, it's never going to be able to access the heart, which doesn't emphasize otherness. It emphasizes sameness. Because you have this tension, right? You have this tension between unity and multiplicity. Multiplicity is when your lower I intellect is saying, do this, do that, consider this. It's always putting you in this relationship of thinking and doing, for good or for worse. But it's always positing the world out there and you here. And we kind of live like this. The modern world, it's more or less derived on this principle. It's based on the principle of, the fully activated partial intelligence in all of its functions, right? From everything from the way we conceive of space, the way we conceive of ourselves. There's always otherness, there's always otherness. And then there's this other kind of knowledge, which we refer to as intelligence, which doesn't see the duality, but it sees unity. And isn't that the name of Islam? One of the names of Islam is Tawheed, right? It's to bring, literally to make one. And the opposite is takthir, making many. So what side do you think the heart is on?
One.
The one. Zayn pish yak diribu lo hazar andishe aknoon hame la ilaha illallah. This famous poet said that before he entered into this way, he had one heart, because we all have one heart. And there were, however, 1,000 thoughts. One heart, 1,000 thoughts. And then he walked the way, reached the end, and he says, but now today, everything has been reduced. All that multiplicity has been reduced to La ilaha illallah. So there seems to be a connection between activating the intelligence at the highest level, walking away from duality, and making the heart come alive through a practice. Who here thinks that that's important? Practice. If you were to like survey, let's say, ask all these great Sufis in human history, even from past to present, if you were to ask them, all these beautiful gifts you share with us in your poetry, the Rumis and the Ibn Arabis and all of these great masters, if we were to ask them all, what's the most important thing on this way? I have all these fancy ideas, the heart, intelligence, the breaking of the ego, getting away from multiplicity. This all sounds great. Sounds like what they teach in my philosophy, department. Well, what I teach in my philosophy department. Just ideas, basically. But what about practice? How much would that factor into the equation for all of them? What do you think they would say? Which one's more important, the ideas or the practice? If you can only pick one. It's not a trick question.
Practice.
Yes, good. I'm glad you all. Does anybody? Yes.
Could there be none?
None. Oh, this is now okay. Now you're starting to move into wahda wujud. Talk about why none. I'm for none. Absolutely.
Because I feel like it could be more intellect. It's like ideas or practice. And if it's the heart, is it just feelings or emotions or they said that the heart is the place of the soul, ruh. And ruh is always connected to the source. So I'm wondering if it's like none.
Okay.
Because being an intellect and really smart.
Yeah.
Would question the practice, you would question the ideas.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah, I see what you're trying to do, and I kind of get it. Okay, so what you're describing is, at the very end of the spiritual path, you'll find sometimes they'll make statements like, there's no me, there's no he, there's no we. It's just no thingness, right? But someone like Rumi, how did he become Rumi? He didn't just wake up one day and wasn't like, hey, all of a sudden there's 55,000 lines of poetry coming from his heart just because he was a really good poet, right? But there's also a meaning that's conveyed, right? It's not secular poetry, it's very spiritual poetry. How did that happen? How did somebody become like that? And let's not take Rumi as an example, because maybe for many that's a very unattainable example. But any other individual who's left a record for us to consider that they've become realized in their words, what would they say? How did they get there? It couldn't have been through nothing. Especially when you're an embodied human being. If we're talking about people who are not embodied, fine. But how does this happen? Without the practice. Practice seems to be very important. Right? That's why. And I think most of you are with me, right, on that? Did I convince you a little bit? No, still? Okay, that's okay. I'm not gonna need to convince you. I got good backup right here. Don't worry about it. We're getting there. There's very little that I have to do actually at this stage. Okay, so yes, I would agree with those who said that practice it's the essential part of all of this, right? Like anything in this world, if you want to become good at it, you have to put in the work, right? You have to do the work. You have to put in the hours, right? So the spiritual path is like that in many ways, right? Sure, you can just be pulled into the presence of God. For every one person that happens for, there's a billion for whom it doesn't happen, right? Most human beings, because we're embodied, we live right now in our bodies, and according to Islamic eschatological teachings, we're not going anywhere without these bodies. They're coming with us. So that means that our very embodiment tells us that we must kind of do something about it. Because we use these bodies all the time throughout the day to walk, to do things, to practice other things. You want to become a tennis player, you got to practice a lot, right? My son always wonders how Steph Curry can always just sink those baskets. It's ridiculous. He never misses or something like that. And I don't even know how many hours and hours and years he must have put into just doing that same move, right? Like, it's just remarkable. But that's what practice does, right? Practice makes a person perfect, they say. Okay, so our authors, and in this case, the guy that I'm going to speak to you about, ʿAyn al-Quḍāt, he's no different. He was a man who understood that there was a path to God. He grew up as in a very venerable tradition. He was the student of the brother of the famous Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. So he had a great spiritual pedigree, and he learned the practice rather early in life. He died at the age of 35, actually. And he was one of the few Sufi figures in the history of Islam who was actually killed by the government. There were actually very remarkably few individuals who were, people we would call Sufis or people on the path, who actually were who got in trouble with the government. What his problem is that he was a very just human being, and he was a judge, and usually they come together, right? He has a sense of justice, he's a judge. Rumi always says that the judge who's compromised is the most unreliable person, right? So, ʿAyn al-Quḍāt, very noteworthy judge in Hamadānī, he was a public figure, and he would criticize the government on the pulpit every single day because they were stealing money from the poor. And he was like, this is just unacceptable, and they basically had him killed for it. So it's a terrible, it was very tragic that happened, but in the few years that he did write, he left behind these gems. And he had access to this great tradition, as I was mentioning, from his early 20s. He says that he had this major opening. Within 20 days, he says, within 20 days he was with his master, Ahmad al-Ghazali, and he had this humongous opening, and then from then onwards, all he sought was to be in the presence of God. Even though he had, many functions in the world, he was still a judge. He had many disciples, spiritual disciples, but he also had people who worked for the government, who were politicians, who used to come to him to learn. He was also a scholar, teaching theology. He was a mathematician. So he was a man who had many turbans to wear, to mix metaphors, many turbans to wear. But he always put first things first. And so what I've done in this book is try to lay out, his path of explaining what the relationship is between the intelligence and the heart, and how to access the heart, and how to do it in a way that's intelligent. Because there are many expositions of the spiritual life which are not really that coherent and meaningful. And one has to be very careful with this. I teach this class every year. It's on mystical and contemplative traditions, and we inevitably get into New Age spirituality and stuff like this, right? And students are enamored by it because it all sounds so nice. Meditation, happiness. Usually you got to pay something like $2,000, and you go hang out at some ashram in California, and you come back and you realize. One time a student came up to me and he said to me, "Sir, I'm on my 3rd degree of self-realization." And how much did that cost you? Right? So the problem there, of course, is that if the intelligence if it's not understood for what it is, then you can have a spiritual life that's kind of not intelligent. And the problem there is that sometimes you really do need your intelligence as you walk the way. It can be a very helpful guide for you, especially when it's the capital I intelligence, when it's the fully activated, operating part of the human being, which is identified with the light of God, by the way. Okay. So what he does in this book, there's a number of things that I've done, but what I thought I'd do with all of you, because this is some of my most favorite passages in the book, and you all seem to be so aware and ready, and I can jump into the really fun stuff. That's not always the case. Sometimes if I talk about this, I have to start with really preliminary stuff. But you're all a very good bunch. Evidently, I'm not with technology yet, right? This always happens. In a lecture, at least once, I'll drop the mic or it'll fall off or something. Anyway, maybe just 1 second. Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna just jump right into these passages. And then we're going to see how the heart, the activation of the heart, it's related to practice. But he does it in a way that is very intelligent. He lays it out in a logical way. That often surprises people. We talk about mysticism. We don't think that it has, as I was saying at the beginning of my talk, something to do with intelligence. When really there are two sides of the same coin. That's why I think I really laud SufiCorner for coming up with this particular title for the series. You know, it's very, very telling. And it sets the tone, it really does, in ways that are very positive. So if you have the book, it's on page 37. I just like to look at a few passages with you. And if you don't have it, then, well, there are copies over there that you can help yourselves too. I think. Right, you can. There's also a rule that if you touch it, you buy it. I'm kidding. That's not a rule at all. But check it out. I mean, it's good to look at the passages. It's good to look at them. So we're on 37. So one thing that should stand out is how direct this author is. It's rare that you find authors like this, especially in Sufism, where there's a lot of, you know, it really depends on the audience. Sometimes they have to cut through a lot of layers of like technical jargon before they start getting to the heart of the matter. And here he is speaking very directly. Does everybody have? Yeah? Okay. So this is on page 37. It's just one line. Look at that. But he says everything in this line here. He says, do not imagine that being an aspirant, somebody traveling the path, aspiring towards God, a murid, an aspirant, do not imagine that being an aspirant is easy work. Easy work. It's not easy work. Nothing is easy. Why would the supreme treasure of the universe, that is the divine presence itself, be easy for you? Right? Anyone who wants an easy way into this is not going to attain it. And the proof that human beings never pick the easy way, even in the spiritual life, is that of all the forms of meditation that became popular in the West, it was Zen meditation that's still probably maybe not as popular as it used to be, but it's still like a big contender for like important form of meditation. That's interesting because it's the hardest form of meditation in all of Buddhism. Right? So we recognize there's something the body has to go through, a certain kind of set of rigor. And here it is. Here he's saying it's not going to be easy work. So don't think it's easy. If you want to do this, you better get ready. In lam, there's a beautiful Arabic saying by Dhunnun. He says, "In qadarta fi badl al-ruh fata'al, wa in lam takun fala tashtaghil bi turuhat al-sufiyya." If you can engage in this business of ours, come, let's see you do it. And if you can't, then don't try to talk about what the Sufis are talking about. Don't just, because that's all just partial intelligence. Then that's just speaking. That's not actual realization. One time, one of my dear teachers said to me, "Tasawwuf yaftanis na baftanis." Sufism is finding, not mental weaving. Mental weaving is the easy part. You can get a whole PhD doing that. By the way, anyone who wants to do a PhD, I have something to tell you. It's not professional suicide for me to admit that it's not hard to get a PhD. You just got to put in the work, right? But it's not a measure of your capital I intelligence. It's a measure of your partial intelligence, right? Which is something. It's nothing to sneeze at, but it's not the goal. It's not like if you get a PhD, you're like, I have ma'rifat now. I have recognition of God. It doesn't work that way. Okay. And then he, again, in the next passage here, which I want to read to you, he puts things into perspective, right? So this is where the intelligence comes in, and it says, first things first. In Arabic, they call it al-aham fal-aham, the most important things first. Okay, so he says, since death is inevitable, you're all going to die one day, and you do not know when it will be, for it is possible at any moment, and might happen at any moment, so you could die at any moment. The prudence of the men, here when he says men, he means the spiritual people. It's not like a sexist term. Hamadānī in Persian, it means people. The prudence of the men entails that the intelligent person not be heedless of. See, he's linking intelligence directly to awareness, and then you're going to see it connected to practice. So if you're intelligent, you will follow this way. And following the way means being aware that death is knocking at your door. You can't do anything to overcome it. Right? What does the Quran say? قُلْ إِنَّ الْمَوْتَ الَّذِي تَفِيرُونَ مِنْهُ فَإِنَّهُ مُلَاقِيكُمْ ثُمَّ تُرَدُّونَ إِلَى عَالِمِ الْغَيْبِ وَالشَّهَادَةِ فَيُنَبِّئُكُم بِمَا كُنتُمْ تَعْمَلُونَ. that death that you're running away from, it's going to catch up to you. And then you'll be returned to the knower of the seen and the unseen, and he will tell you what you were doing. So you're going back, is what is the ultimate idea here. Now, look at the next page, 38. It's the third passage from the top. Recognition of God. This is Ma'rifah. Recognition of God is only obtained through correct meditation. I am speaking about meditation, not reflective thinking. Not reflective. Because reflective thinking, that's that cogitative ability that we're speaking about. That's the partial intelligence. That's not how you get to recognize God, by doing more thinking. The problem with the thinking is that it posits that duality that will always keep you separate from God. That's why it's a problem. That's why it's called partial intelligence, right? What is the verse of Hafiz? میان عاشق و معشوق هیچ حائل نیست تو خود حجاب خودی حافظ از میان برخیز. That between the lover and the beloved there's no veil. You yourself, he's talking to himself, you yourself are the veil. So lift what stands between you and God. That's yourself, right? That's the problem. You're in the way. So if you're always insisting on your own partial ways of knowing and your own categories, and you want to put God into like these little intellectual boxes, and then there's a whole discipline called Kalam, Islamic theology. You can go study that, and you can have that kind of othering relationship with God, but you're not going to have the ma'rifat that he's speaking about. Okay, next one. Correct meditation is only obtained, here it is, by a limpid heart, a subtle heart, that is pure from worldly occupations and bodily attachments. So, how do you activate the meditation properly? That practice? Well, your heart, as some of you were noting, has to be free of mixture from the things in the world. It doesn't mean you have to retreat to like a cave and go live in a cave. And Islam doesn't have monasticism, right? So that was never like a spiritual ideal or a possibility for 99% of Muslims who were like this. And they all lived normal lives, they had jobs, all that kind of thing. And in the midst of all of that, the craziness of life, they sought to be detached from the world, right? Live in the world, but don't be of it, they say. You know that famous saying. So he's saying the same thing. He's like, you have all these attachments, right? But as long as they're not, situated in your heart, then you can have the entire world, or you can have nothing. There's many, many beautiful Sufi stories about a faqir who has nothing, but his master always, chides him, pushes him away, because it turns out that this guy, even though he's got nothing, and he looks like he's like this poor faqir, in truth, his heart is just hankering after the world. He just can't, get over the fact that he doesn't have it, but pretends that he does have all this like psychological detachment, but he's really attached. So attachment doesn't have to do with physical possession or lack thereof. It just has to do with the psychological requirements that we accord to ourselves and our relationship vis-a-vis those things. If you want them, and if you're attached to the world and worldliness and things and status and whatever the case may be, then you'll never be able to have this kind of purity of heart, because your heart's in 50 different directions. Just like, I don't want to mention the certain German philosopher, but there was one in particular who used to eat like bread and cheese and lived like in a little tower, and he was kind of like a dork, to be honest with you. There's no other way to describe this guy. And then he wrote influential books that kind of were really against sacred knowledge. But in the end, it didn't mean that he was detached in any way just because he just ate bread and cheese, right? He was very attached to something called the partial intelligence, and it built an entire philosophy of existence around it, and then the modern world gobbled most of that up. So it really depends on where you are in your heart psychologically and spiritually. Okay, are you following me so far? Yeah? Good. All right. Like I say, he's very direct. You have a question? You can, by the way, feel free to if you have a question at any point, you can interject.
I don't know if this is a silly question, but you're pointing to here when you're talking about it. And so is the spiritual heart here?
Well,
or
well,
is it related to the physical heart? Or where is the spiritual heart?
That's a great question. In traditional symbolism, you'll often see people pointing to their heart. Like you'll see, like in like famous icons, for example, of Christ, for example, pointing at the physical heart, right? The physical heart is always seen as like symbolizing, or representing the symbol, right, of the heart. Where the actual heart is, often when they try to locate where it is in a human being, number one, it's not in you. Right, because it's not a physical organ, right? We're made up of like physical matter. But if you were to like localize it within a particular part of the human being, it would be kind of like right here, like in like just the center, literally the center of the being. You see a lot of
chakra and the
yeah, you'll find exactly, and in many traditional forms of meditation, many conceptions of like the subtle bodies, for example, or subtle energies. It all has to do with like the centeredness, right? And so often they'll point like not in you, but like through you, right? There's many stories of like saints coming and like pointing at people and like putting like a fire through their bodies, right? So the most central part of the entire human totality would be right here, right? So often I just when I go like this, I just mean the heart, But I'm referring to that exactly, yeah. Okay, good. That was a good question. That wasn't a bad question. I tell my students that we're told that there are no such things as bad questions, and I say to them, but I'm here to tell you that there are. There are many. There are bad questions, and there are stupid questions too. But that wasn't one of them. That was an excellent question. Yes.
I had one question, but I think she asked like, where is this? I wanted to see if you had an answer to that, which is where is there a location in the spiritual heart?
Yeah, that's vis-a-vis the human being. But later on, I'll explain to you that the relationship of the heart to the human is just like the relationship of God to the human. Right? So where is God? That's where the heart is.
So like the pathway to accessing this, you mentioned meditation in there, and forgive me if this is outside of the topic, but what is like a practical meditation method that you would recommend or like, you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So right, that's another very good question. So when the Sufis speak about meditation, right, generally they use many different words, right? The one that we're the most used to hearing is the word dhikr, right? Dhikr, and dhikr there's different levels of dhikr. Remember, the word dhikr in Arabic has to do with remembering, right? Remembering. It also has to do with recalling, and it also has to do with mentioning. Interestingly enough, it's also the name for man, a human being. There's like this joke in Arabic that the word dhikr, to remember, comes from, it's a reference to the man, and the word nisa comes from a root that means to forget, which is actually etymologically not true, but it's like a joke amongst Arabs. So one time I said to my wife, I said to her, why is it that the women, your root comes from to forget, and the man's root comes from to remember? And then she said, well, that's because she's Punjabi, They have a way with, they know how to get to the heart of the matter. She said, that's because you have to remember all the good things we do for you, and you guys, we have to forget all the stupid things you guys do. That's how she answered the question. So the word dhikr has many levels, right? And the Quran says, for example, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu dhkuru Allaha dhikran kathira, right? Remember God a lot, right? وَسَبِّحُهُ بُكْرَةً وَأَصِيلًا, and glorify Him night and day. So you're always supposed to remember God. الَّذِينَ يَذْكُرُونَ اللَّهَ قِيَامًا وَقُعُودًا وَعَلَى جُنُوبِهِم. Referring to these people, they remember God standing, when they're sitting, and when they're lying down. And you're only in one of those three positions as a person. So these people are remembering God all the time. So it's not like a recommendation, it's something you're supposed to do, right? Now, of course, not everybody can always be in the state of dhikr, so there are practices throughout the day that Muslims, just in their daily prayers, don't have to be practicing Sufi, you perform the dhikrs. A person who's on the Sufi path, they've taken an instruction for very particular meditative forms, which vary. There can be meditations on particular divine names, or the divine name of Allah itself, or other practices, right? Some dhikrs are looking in the cosmos and doing dhikr of the names of God. There's many, many, many levels to this. There isn't just one, it's not a one-size-fits-all formula, right? Just like if you were to go to a doctor's not going to give one medication to every single person that comes to the door, right? It really depends on what problem they have and what they need. So the dhikr is, there's a general kind of accessibility for it, for sure. Amongst the Sufis though, because theirs is the way of, it's an initiatory path, they have also transmissions of very special forms of dhikr. Now, of course, this was a practice by the Prophet himself, right? He taught the companions, some of them he taught them some things, and some of them he didn't teach those same things. There's a very famous report by Abu Huraira who says that, I learned two kinds of knowledge from the Prophet. Right? One I've shared with you, and the other one I haven't disclosed it. If I were to do so, he went like that, you would kill me. Or لَرَجَمْتُمُونِي بِالْحِجَارَةِ, you'd stone me to death. Because there's certain levels of what's going on to all of this, right? It's not again one size fits all. So the long and the short of it is that's when we speak about the practice of dhikr, it really depends on where a person's at. Right? So when ʿAyn al-Quḍāt is speaking about it, he's really addressing anyone who's interested in taking that step to God. Maybe they're already on the spiritual path, or maybe they're thinking about joining it. But to get to the end, he would insist that you have to have an initiatory path for sure. It doesn't mean a person cannot be a spiritual person without some kind of dhikr, right? For sure you can, but eventually you're going to need some kind of objective help, right? And that's the beauty of the spiritual way, is that it's not a do-it-yourself kind of philosophy. That's why I was deriding New Ageism earlier, right? This is a way of help. It's a way of companionship and friendship. And ʿAyn al-Quḍāt, he refers to those people who are on the way. He says that they become brothers or sisters. There's a fraternity amongst them. And he even takes it so far as to say that sure, we cannot become a companion of the Prophet in this world, because his companions, that was a status. People who met him, believed in him, and died believing in him. But he goes, you can become his brother though, through the dhikr. So that ikhwaniyat, they call it, that's open all the time. And that's what he's trying to take us to. He's trying to say, look, you can activate that still. You can activate that. And you'll see other ways he does it. He shows us how to do that. Okay, good. Any other questions so far? How am I doing for time, by the way? Because I could just go on and on if you don't stop me. I wouldn't even know. So, yeah, good. If it's getting out outrageously late, then
45 minutes is long.
Okay, I was thinking more like midnight. If it's like midnight, I'm kidding. Yeah, that 45 minutes is good. Okay, so continue down the page. There's two here that I think are very key. This one passage is important because this has to do with situating that partialness of the human being and saying, look, we can all know little facts about things, but who cares about little facts? Let's know like what it's really all about, right? But let's understand this knowledge as it relates to us, not as it relates to other people. Be concerned with your own self here. It's some people might say that Sufism or the spiritual way is a very selfish way. Yeah, that's one way to look at it, but the alternative is that you're going to be an ill individual walking around trying to cure people. Right? It's much better that you solve your own problem first, and then you can go help people. Right? You have to escape that burning house to come back with the right equipment to take other people out. Right? So there's nothing selfish about it, but there is something selfish about it if you mean by self capital S, because they're concerned with the supreme self. In which case there are no distinctions between small selves and capital S selves. Look what he says here. Of what concern is the entirety of the sun to you? Your share from the sun is for your home to be illumined in its entirety. You just got to focus on yourself, is what he's trying to say. Don't worry about saving the world. First of all, you're not going to be able to do it. Second of all, you'll die trying. Even if you could do it, there's no way you'll achieve that in one lifetime, right? But you could save yourself with the right help and with the right intentions, right? قَدْ أَفْلَحَ مَنْ زَكَّاهَا, the Quran says, وَقَدْ خَابَ مَنْ دَسَّاهَا. The one who cultivates or purifies, who cultivates the soul, that person is the one who is successful, and then the one who causes it to get ruined, he sinks down. Right? So either you're going up or you're going down. Okay, look at the next one. This is my favorite one. So this is kind of an answer to Abdul's question about at least how to do it. Frequent invocation, this is a reference to the Quran that I cited. Frequent invocation is for you to invoke with your entirety. It's to invoke, pray, in this case, do the zikr with all of yourself. You know, if you're like really into something, let's say a subject, or like a sport, you're like just plugged in, you're like totally, right? Now we can do that with things in the world easily. Our favorite show, our favorite food, maybe a person that we like, or a book that we like, or a movie. But what about the king of the universe? What about the very root of our own selves? How often, he's saying here, how often would we do that for God? Give our entirety to God. He's saying, well, if you always want to remember God, and then, because that's what the Quran says, to remember God all the time, then you have to give all of yourself. Hamagi, right? Entirety, your entirety. For you to invoke with your entirety, not a single speck of your makeup, what you're made up of, should be left out. It should just be all you. And then there's a verse he quotes, remember me is here, because the verse says, remember me and I'll remember you. With kuruni adkurkum. Right? So God says, remember me and I'll remember you. And there's many levels to that verse that I don't want to get into, but he's citing it for a reason. He's saying that if you want to remember God in a deep metaphysical sense, it's really God who first has to remember you. There's no you turning to God. That's too egotistical. Right? You have to kind of. Right? So the best thing that you could ever possibly do is just be no thing before God. That's why they place so much emphasis upon faqir, being a faqir, what they call faqr, right? Or darwishi, right? Somebody who is poor before God. To be poor before God means that you have nothing, and you understood that you have nothing. One time I remember talking to a relative, and I said, look, they were asking about Sufism, and I said, well, it's the way of poverty. And he's like, I'm not interested, actually. Or there was this one aunt that we knew, you know, she was an older and very funny woman, and then, I don't know, she was looking to get remarried. And then we said to her, and does anyone know Urdu in here? So it's a play on the Urdu, which is why it's very funny. So we said to her, oh, we're going to find you a nice faqir. And she's like, I don't want a faqir, I want an amir. Amir in this case means somebody who's rich, right? Who has money, right? As opposed to, because usually it means like a prince or a leader, right? So that was her answer. But why realize our poverty? Because the Quran says, God says, He says, He is the rich. He has, the riches are on His side. He has everything, right? And on a totally existential, ontological level, He has existence. That's His. It's not ours. Ours, they say, it's lent to us, right? And everything that is borrowed, you have to return it to its rightful owner. It's not yours. It's not yours to begin with. So you can't just do anything with your existence that you want. You can, but then that verse says those who do that will go down, right? You don't want to go down. You want to go up. Human beings always want to go up, not down. I always tell my students, why do we say what's up or word up as opposed to word down? There's a reason. Like our souls are, right? We're naturally inclined towards going up. Okay. So are you with me so far? You're following me? Okay, now there's a few things that I want. There's a set of passages on page 118. Go there for a second. And then we'll see a couple of texts about the heart, which are very important. Before getting there, let's just pause just for a little while, for maybe like 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Let me see if there are any questions or comments or concerns or anything like that. Because we're going to switch gears slightly in a moment. Are you all following me so far? It's pretty straightforward stuff, right? This is all easy stuff. At the same time, they say that walking that path of transcendence, it's harder than clawing at a mountain with your nails. It's much more difficult than it is to climb. But that's if it's us doing it, then it's a very difficult task, right? But luckily, it's not. He says, don't say that we don't have a way of access to that king. With the help of the generous, all actions are possible. Everything is possible. When it's from your side, it's not possible. But when it's from the divine side, everything is possible. Yes.
So I have a question around, I guess the terms, the heart, the intellect, consciousness.
Yeah.
Or, so they're called the akil and nafs, I suppose. Do we talk a little bit about how consciousness plays into all of this
Sure.
as well?
Yeah.
The connection of the intellect and the heart.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very good question too. You'll notice that I didn't bring up, I didn't try to like identify or define a lot of these terms, and the reason is because number one, especially once you get into the texts, like there are many levels of complication between the kinds of conceptions of selfhood that are at stake. He does it one way in this author. If you turn to Imam al-Ghazali, for example, slightly different way of conceiving of these different dimensions of the person. If you go to Ahmed Sirhindi, there are different ways. It really depends on the author you're looking at, because they understand different parts of a human selfhood, not in contradiction to other parts, but they see them, they emphasize one or more dimensions of the same reality. But generally, we come up with like a very, very general schema. It looks something like this. The word for self in Arabic is nafs, which means many things. It comes from a root, first of all, in Arabic that has to do with something that's precious. Right? So it tells you what, it tells you a lot about what we think we are, right? I'm precious. How dare anybody talk to me like that? Right? Do you know who I am? That special, that precious stone that's walking around and that's a gift to humanity. I remember Seinfeld, that episode in Seinfeld where he makes conceiving of a world without her. She goes, a world without me? What would that possibly look like? Right? So that's the nafs. That's what it does. It's always insisting on its being this great special thing that the world absolutely needs. Rumi says that it's it starts off as a small snake, but then you keep feeding it and it becomes a big dragon. Right? At the end of it, that's the goal, and then it just devours everything, right? So that part of this of the human self, that alone has there are many complicated things about it. But just do away with all of that just for the purposes of this discussion, and just consider it really as the ego. The ego. When it's in its lowest form, it's basically the fallen individual, and it has what they call blameworthy quality traits. And that's why one way they talk about the nafs, and I get into in this book, is that it is basically all the negative qualities of a person that just kind of combine into this one individual. Hatred, envy, jealousy, whatever the case may be, all in this person. And then a person who starts chipping away at that, slowly, they start rising up, right? So this is known as, when it's this lower, yucky, gross kind of nafs, it's known as the nafs al-amara bisu in the Quran. It's the soul that commands to act ugly towards ugliness. Su is ugliness, right? And so it stands in opposition to the divine beauty, right? It's that part that pushes you to your, the worst moments of a human being, basically. You might have good moments too, right? No one's essentially ugly and evil, right? But the predominant tendency of an individual like that is that they're veering towards ugliness. Then a person who's awakened to that reality, is trying to do something about it, they rise up to another level of nafs. See why it's a little complicated? That's not in you in any way. It's just a transformation of awareness that's taking place. And it's your intelligence that's doing all of this awareness, right? This is now a nafsul al-lawama. It's the soul that starts blaming itself. Right? Why did I say that? I wish I didn't use that word. I should be more careful with my actions next time. Maybe something that I did impacted this person in a negative way, for example. So you start kind of becoming introspective, right? And then eventually, through the dhikr and through transformation, when all the blameworthy traits become praiseworthy, you replace them. Basically, that's what they call Sufism. They literally say it's change from the ugly to the beautiful. It's, transforming your character, really. Then it becomes the highest level, the soul that is mutma'inna, nafsul mutma'inna. Again from the Quran, it's the tranquil soul. When the Quran says to that person who's attained this level, God says in the Quran, right, that return to your Lord pleased and well-pleasing. So this is a person who's perfected all of that negative quality traits. Now we're not talking about the nafs anymore, that lower self. This is a very high transformed individual. This is the actualized human being, right? And usually they associate that with the alive heart. Right? That's kind of why it's complicated. The ruh is another, that's kind of like, you know, it's also seen as the highest dimension of the heart, for example. Sometimes it's identified with it. And sometimes they're all commensurate with the intelligence too, right? But if you want to just have like a takeaway, like about what the heart is, the simplest thing that I've ever seen somebody write about the heart, and which seems to make the most sense across the texts that we're dealing with, is that it corresponds to the consciousness, just like Abdul was saying. It's the aware principle within the individual. But insofar as you are separate from God, there's a relationship between the divine and the human being, right? Ittisali has ittisali bi takayyuf bi qiyas, has Rabb al-Nas, Rabb Jan al-Nas, where he says there is an intimate connection without asking how and without knowing where between the spirit of the human being and the spirit of the Lord of the human being. At that level, of course, it's tawheed and oneness. And the goal of all of this is really to break away from all that otherness and duality and move towards oneness. When it's no longer us individual fallen selves that are doing all of this knowing and awareness, right? That again, it's a transformed entity. It's God looking at us looking through us or at us and seeing Himself. And we'll see that in a moment where He gets into the actualized heart. What is the heart really from the human side of things? Okay, let's continue. This is a good question. Yes?
At that stage, would you consider a wali of a wali?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, wali. And generally the term wali, like it's one of those terms that in English it can mean so many different things, right? Like it's translated often as saint. The word wali really, it comes from a word in Arabic that has to do with somebody taking over for you. Walla means to like appoint somebody. Like in marriage, for example, when the girl says yes, right? She has a wali who says yes on her behalf. Usually like the father or the brother or the uncle, right? So somebody who's acting on your behalf. So somebody who becomes a wali of God, God has taken over their affairs for them.
So you become Allah becomes the eyes in which you see.
Yeah, exactly like that. He says exactly, right? And the trick there is that He doesn't become them, but He's always been them. You'll notice in Arabic it says, I am the hands with which He grasps, the eye with which He sees, the foot upon which He walks. If He asks me, I will surely give Him whatever He asks me for. And if He seeks my help, I will give Him my help. So, but the thing is that we're not aware of that. That's why to us it's like He becomes them, right? But the truth is this is already the case, right? God's not changing anytime soon or ever, right? God doesn't change, it's us who changes. Right? We're the ones who have to go through all of this transformation in order to realize what was already the case to begin with. Right? It's just that we're not aware. That's kind of why we have to go through life, right? Like one time somebody asked, right, why couldn't I just have been born in heaven to begin with? Why do I have to come here and go through all this misery and stuff and really, walk through life with all of its pleasures and pains? And the answer that one of these masters gave once was, well, when you were there, you weren't really aware that you were there, right? But you had to come. Now you come to life. You see what separation is. Then you'll know what union is. If you know what pain is, then you'll know what joy is. But you have to enter into the world of dualities in order to understand what unity is all about. And that's one of the great mysteries of existence. That's what al-Quḍāt talks about extensively, and many authors in that tradition. Ibn Arabi, Rumi, of course, Mullah Sadr, all of them emphasize this, right? Like you've been put here in order to wake up. Right? لِيَبْلُوكُمْ, the Quran says, لِيَبْلُوكُمْ أَيُّكُمْ أَحْسَنُ عَمَلًا, to test you, to see, that is for you to realize, which of you is the most beautiful in action. Usually it's translated as the best in action, but the word is not best in Arabic, it's the most beautiful. So you're here to actualize beauty. That's what this is all about. Right? And you'll notice that human beings are never indifferent to beautiful things and beautiful people.
So when you
Yes.
talking about, I just thought about the baby in the mother's womb.
Yeah.
So when the baby is there, it is with the mom, but he doesn't know
Yeah.
that, and then the separation comes.
Yes.
It's just
Yes, exactly. Exactly right. Exactly. Yeah. And this is why we have to go through all of this difficulty, right? You go through it to realize something then about yourself. Now you return back with knowledge. There's a very different place then. You understand things a whole lot different. Things that are given to you in life, if they're just given to you, you'll notice that you don't appreciate them as much as if you've earned them. If you've gone through toil and difficulty and you earned something, you're going to have a very different relationship with that thing. Right? It's like with kids, right? You tell them like to do something and you're like, look, that's because you didn't pay for that. That's why you don't care. But the person who got that for you had to go through a lot of difficulty, just to get that toy for you that you just, right? They don't realize till they're later, till later in life. When they get older, then they realize. So that's normal. That's why I think that, of all the funny things that are said about Sufism, often people make it look like it's like this like totally arcane discipline that nobody can access. It's like somehow just out of reach of ordinary people. But it seems to be quite the opposite. It's really just telling you things that you actually already know. That's why there's such an affinity when you hear about authors like ʿAyn, al-Quḍāt, or Rubin, and people kind of already get it. Like, yeah, I've already, these are things that I already know. It's not like, it's nothing really new here. And that's why the Quran speaks about that. It's the Quran itself being, in one verse, it refers to it as a mention, a dhikr, of you. وَفِي ذِكْرُكُمْ, it's the mention of you. Isn't that interesting? Right? You read the verse 1,000 times and not see it, but then if you stop, you're like, wait a second. It's saying, I'm being spoken about here. It's really all about you. But don't let it get to your ego. It's all about you, but not because you're special in that way, right? You are special, but in other ways. Yes.
Yeah, I just think that what you said about the heart being subjective human conscious awareness resonated, because I feel like more atheistic, scientific, partial intelligence, what we're calling, is maintained that truth is that which is separate from you. It's objective. The more you can make sure your truth is pure, the less it's contaminated by you. It's objective, meaning it's not a world outside of yourself.
Yeah.
And so maybe this, what we're talking about, the heart, is this re-acknowledgement that any truth that does not contain the self is an incomplete truth, because the conscious experience is what somebody said is what creates meaning.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Good. Yeah, very good. Heidegger very famously said that science does not think, right? And by it, this comes part and parcel with like a deep critique of the so-called objective aims of science, right? I remember many years ago, Professor Nasser, Sayyid Hussein Nasser, the famous scientist, philosopher, you probably have read his stuff. At a very young age, when he was in his early 20s, he had met Bertrand Russell, who said to him, physics is not like an objective explanation of the world. It's just a mathematically arranged exposition based on the givens that are up for grabs, right? So I always tell my students, when we talk about objective knowledge, I say to them things like, okay, so let's say the sun is out, and objectively you know, because you've read in your science textbooks, that we're not at the center of this universe. Our solar system, the reason it's called a solar system is because the sun's at the center and we're kind of revolving, and we are revolving around it. But your eyes are telling you something else, because when you look up, you see the sun there. And then they all start thinking like on one of these these round earth deniers or whatever they're called, right? And I say to them, I'm not trying to play with your mind, I'm just telling you that the only way you could really experience that physical explanation is if you were on the moon, for example. But you don't live on the moon, right? You live on Earth, and according to your totally subjective experience of the world, and subjective being not a bad thing because we're subjects, you have to see the world in the way that it's presenting itself to you. And if you don't, then you're deluding yourself, right? Then they're like, this guy's crazy, man. Is he saying that science uses? And I'm just saying that there is an objective way to look at things, and And for the philosophers and Sufis, they would say that that's God's way of looking at things, right? That's God's vision into the world, right? He's a supreme subject and object. But in the rest of us, though, we're just subjects. All right, good. That was a very good. Yes.
I was thinking about two things you said. The first is the fakir, and the second is the narration of, or the reason. I think it was Ibn Arabi's explanation of why we exist on this earth. And I was going to mention the exact same story. I think he says it is about the ingestion of the forbidden fruits, which is what gives us shur. I'm not sure if that's how that word is pronounced in Arabic, but it's. I'm not sure how we translate it. Maybe phenomenal consciousness.
Yeah, shur.
And well, the Quran doesn't mention it as an apple, but the forbidden fruit is what imbues in humans the shur, which automatically sort of removes them from the primordial state. I mean, Adam and Eve from the primordial existence in heaven, which is one where the boundary between oneself and God does not exist. It is ultimate tawheed, essentially.
Yeah.
And then we are sent into the earth, and then there's this quotation in 246, which I was thinking about. al-Quḍāt calls the poor one, that is the servant who realizes the true nature of his ontological indigence. Yourself should live in selfhood until you become all he, then poverty will appear. This poverty will be perfected. When poverty is perfected, he is God.
He is God.
That is, your entirety will be he. So that's a negation of the shur, and therefore the reattainment of the original state prior to the ingestion of the
which is our fundamental poverty.
Yes, and I was also reminded of this hadith that says the gates of paradise will first open to the fuqara. That's the word I was checking if that was the word that it uses, and it is. And the rich will enter one day later, but that one day will feel like an eternity of 500 years. But I think that was the second hadith, and that is usually interpreted in the sense of a fakir being, a literal poor person, and in a lot of in Islamic architecture, that's a very common quote on soup kitchens, imarats that were built for poor people. So that's one kalam, that's one level of understanding that was used in. But considering this, in the Ibn Arabi story, it seems that it refers more generally, or the Prophet was talking about more generally. On a higher level.
On a specific level to the Sufis.
Yes.
Yeah, well, that's, I mean, there are different levels, depends on who's looking, some people, if they have often it's the case that, one word can be used and then he could have meant several things. It depends on the listener, right? Exactly. But it's interesting that the word shu'ur, which it's usually translated as awareness, right? Usually translated as awareness. And someone like Ibn Sadr, again, very close to what you just read, he would say, well, if you look at what presence is, presence, awareness, and existence, right? They're all really talking about the exact same phenomenon, which is just this kind of universal awareness. In Hindu metaphysics, of course, they call it being consciousness bliss, Sat Chit Ananda. And in Sufism, it's the same. It's wajd, wujud, wujdan. Right? Wajd is like consciousness. Wujud is finding or existence, and then wujdan is the joy. Or the wajd is the joy, and the wujdan is the consciousness. If you lose something, let's say I'm thirsty and I lose this, right? It's gone, right? Now I have to go find it. So I undergo a process of wujud, right? I find it, now I'm aware of it, wujdan, and what happens? I'm happy. Right, and then so that's the whole cycle of existence. It just goes between that ternary, right? At the highest metaphysical level, it's God who's doing all of this awareness, but it's through us. From the human perspective, it's interesting because the word shu'ur comes from a root that has to do with poetry, shi'r, and also hair, right, and extensivity and subtlety. So it's almost as if to say, and when Professor Ogunaike comes, he can speak about this because this is one of his fortes. His poetry is that interaction with the divine, it comes closer to like a poem and the subtleties that are involved in decoding a poem than it does like in prose kind of expositions, which is why there's that relationship between awareness in the poem and the subtlety of the hair. So that's interesting. And all of which there's this faqir who's just negotiating their space. I hope that wasn't too exclusive of it, but you're an architect, so I was addressing some of these things on that level for you. Good. This is very good. Any more questions? Yeah.
You spoke about unity and multiplicity, and I guess I was wondering, like, why is that kind of like the central theme of Islam? Like, I'm quite puzzled that, like, God has many attributes, and it seems His oneness is kind of central to, like, a lot of things. Like, even mysticism is like, that unity is like strongly emphasized. And like, I was wondering, like, why isn't God's, like, His role as creator or His role as sustainer equally, like, is there a reason that, like, oneness kind of points to all these other things?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So first of all, it's important to keep in mind that for the Sufis, when they speak about God's names and attributes, they're not speaking about God as multiple, right? They're speaking about the same one God, who's manifesting itself in different ways through the relationships that are obtained vis-a-vis, in this case, human beings. So let's say, like myself, I'm one person, right? Now, depending on the relationships that are around me, I'll take on different names. I'll be father for my kids, for example, teacher for my students, friend for my friend, for example, son for my father. So that doesn't make me more than one. That's one individual, but just there's different relationships, right? So the advantage and the great blessing of the multiple names of the divine is that you call upon them in accordance with where you're at. So Ibn Arabi says, right, the drowning person doesn't call on the creator. He calls on Ya Nasir, the helper, right? Because that's what he needs at that moment, right? There's a saying in English, right? There are no drowning atheists, right? right? That is to say, you're going to call on somebody. You're going to say help, right? So when that happens, really you're calling on God, right? So that's the easy part of it, which is that the names don't make God he doesn't make him like more than one. There is a debate in early Islamic theology on where they're situated. That's another issue altogether, right? Which we don't need to get into here, especially because the Sufis think that those discussions are a little bit kind of like amateur, right? Because for them it's easier just relationships. So relationships are not things, but they do speak about actual entities, right? That you can localize. But the reason there's emphasis upon Tawheed as opposed to multiplicity, because multiplicity has to do with manyness and stratification and diversification and kind of like othering, and if it had like a movement, it would be going like that, right? Whereas Tawheed, that has to do with oneness, integrity, right? Union, joining. Notice in people when they pray, they go like this. They're taking the multiple world, everything, and they're putting it all into one. In the Muslim daily prayers, when you Allahu Akbar, you take the whole world and you just throw it behind you. I'm not making that up. That's literally what they say, right? I wish I had made that up. That's brilliant. It's in Ibn Arabi, You take the world and you just go like that. You just throw it behind you, and then now you're in front of God. And so, God is one. That's one of the names of the divine, right? And at the highest metaphysical level, the reason there's only one as opposed to two. This is a subtle philosophical point, but I need to kind of make this. Because the Sufis themselves make this point. If there were two gods, let's just say, or multiple gods, right? And there would have to be preponderance of one over the other. They couldn't be equal, right? So at one point they're competing or something, and one's a little higher than the other. But if you're saying, let's say that no, they're actually all the same. Well, if they're all the same in every dimension, let's say, let's use physical descriptions, extension, spatiality, all of these things, then there wouldn't be two, there would be one. Right? So the basis of all things comes from a singular point. And the goal really is to traverse all of the multiple levels to get back to that one. Because the oneness is the wholeness. And they relate it to the human being, to the realization of their felicity or sa'ada. right? Your own sense of wholeness comes from that oneness. I hope that clarifies things for you.
That was very cool, thank you.
Okay, good. Good, okay. A cool answer is a good answer. That means, okay, good. Yeah.
I just have a quick question, because we're talking about oneness, is that I'm just curious because there's a lot of talk about Tawheed and complete unity and oneness, and Ibn Arabi has the ʿUḥdāt al-Wujūd, but what separates this from a general pantheistic view? Like a lot of even secular philosophers, maybe like Spinoza, etc., also purport the same unity of existence. We are all God, everything is God. I'm just curious what distinguishes Sufistic conception of a unity and Tawheed from these others.
Okay, so there's an easy way out, and then there's a slightly longer way. I'll do both. The easy way out is I wrote an article on this. It's called Is Ibn Arabi's ontology pantheistic? So there you'll get the details about what I'm going to say right now. The reason God in Sufism, or the oneness of being, or whatever you want to call it, the oneness of existence, the reason it doesn't amount to pantheism is because pantheism doesn't accept gradations in existence between God and the world. God essentially is identified with this world, right? And for Sufism, that would be like anathema, because that's like making God, putting literally God into things, right? Whereas they always maintain that distance. It's like the sun and the rays, perfect example. You got the sun and then you have the rays. So one author, who I didn't quote in that article, and I wish I'd seen this quote because I think he just solved it so brilliantly. He said that it's not that God is plunged in the world, which is wrong, but rather that it's the world, it's plunged in God. It's a completely different way of looking at things, right? What's this world is nothing that we should even consider whether God is in it or not. The much more accurate picture is that this world itself is actually in the divine, right? But the divine itself is not essentially identified with the world. Right? Essential identification would be amount to pantheism, and even some form of panentheism. All of these terms today that they use. Panpsychism is another one that they're talking about consciousness. They're just terms, that people fling around. That's a good question, though. I hope that satisfies you. And for the cool point, I say read the article. You might. And it has some details in it, and we get into a little bit of even the English word pantheism, where it came from. Yeah, where it first originated. It's actually very interesting because it was always associated with atheism. Yeah, it's really strange. You would think that pantheism, right, is not atheistic, but a lot of Christian writers in the 15th, 16th centuries, they were like, this is basically atheism. Yeah. Good. So, do you have any questions so far? I have a few more things I want to share with you. You following me all so far, right? Good. Good. I'm happy. You guys are a good bunch. I mean, it's a Friday night in New York. In New York, on a Friday night. Here you guys are learning about al-Quḍāt. This is incredible. Here we go. So this is on page 118. For those of you who have the book. So this is probably my most favorite of all the passages in the whole book because it's so straightforward. And if anyone asks, like what's the take home from what was said today, I would say, let's just say there was no take home. Let's just say that you just walked away with nothing. Fine. But this passage here, don't let this one escape you. This is really the one. It's on page 118, the second one to the top. It's so straightforward. God does not have any condition for you, but that you empty your heart. That's all that God wants from you. Nothing else. Just let it all go. Let everything go. It's interesting because the thing that's the hardest for us to do is actually the easiest thing to do. The reason emptying the heart is so difficult, they say, is that we have built up a lot of psychological narratives of how important our attachments are to us. if you think about it logically, right, what of them are so important actually? Even to the point that let's say you say, fine, I'm not attached to anything, but I have to hold on to my existence, otherwise I die. No, I mean I'm not saying go kill yourself. I'm just saying, just live, right? But live, as he's saying, live in a way that fulfills that condition. Empty your heart. The person whose heart is empty, that is to say they have no ulterior motives. I remember one time I was listening to this one Sufi story, and it went something like this. There's this king, and he's sitting on his throne, and of course he owns a kingdom. He owns everything. Everybody needs him. He doesn't need them. And the courtiers who are around him obviously need him, and they want his company, but for other things. They want the fame, the riches. They don't want to get their heads cut off. Things like that. The reason people hang around kings. And then there's this one vagabond who walks in, and he comes up to the king and he says, "I actually don't want anything. You can do with me whatever you want. You want to kill me, fine. You want to give me a palace, whatever. Or you want to marry me to your daughter, I'll take that. I'm sure I that part. But, gotta make them fun, these stories. This is a masala, gotta throw some masala. Right? Whatever you do, I'll be happy with it." The king says to him, "Well, what, you don't want anything from me?" And he says, "I just want to be with you. You're the king. And being with the king is alone where all of my peace is." And so guess what the king does to him? Right? He looks at all the other courtiers and thinks that they're bums, basically. He says, "You guys are all frauds. This is the real one. He's the one." Right? And he's come with just himself. That's all he came with, nothing else. No sophistication, no knowledge really of anything other than the fact that he's nothing, which is the highest form of knowing. And ultimately, no attachment to anything other than the king. So another good way to think about what Sufis do is that, and again, it's not my own description, this is what they say, is that they attach themselves to God through the implication. Because you can't attach yourself to God. How are you going to do that, right? You need to come like you would with the beloved. You would come to your beloved through their name. So the same thing with God. You come to God with the name and you attach yourself to the name. Once the name of God is attached to you, it wipes everything else away. That's often why they liken it to a fire. Right? It's a fire. When it lands on something or it touches it, it sets the whole thing ablaze. al-Quḍāt has a whole explanation, which maybe we'll talk a little bit about tomorrow, where he speaks about when that fire kind of enters into your being and it burns you away. What's left? Nothing. He says it's just the color of fire, right? Which is ash. From your perspective, it's just ash. It's nothing. And all is fire. His fire is love, right? Remember that Rumi poem? I told you I quote a lot of Rumi. I don't know why. I'm just on a Rumi bug these days. No, I'm kidding. I love Rumi. That's why. He describing his own life. He says, "Hasle umram says sukhan bish nist, kham budam pokhte shodam sukhtan." The summary of my life is these three words: no more. I was raw. I became ripe, and then I burned. So here he's just saying, empty yourself. That's all you have to do. Okay, now, look at this one here. Again, one of my favorite. This one, he's getting at the people who perform the rites of Islam as they should, but he's saying, don't stop there. Don't just do these things and then think that you've done your job properly. That's just the beginning. You have to live the inner life. That's the hard part. He says, whoever does not have a heart is not a human. And everyone has a heart. It is they who are healers. But he's saying you haven't realized the goal of humanity. Right? You don't have a heart, you're not a human. Seeing that you are human and have reached maturity, praying, fasting, performing the Hajj, and paying the alms tax are obligatory upon you. So you have to do the pillars of Islam. You have to do them. But ahead of all of these, the search for the heart is obligatory. And then he quotes a verse from the Quran, "Have they not journeyed upon the earth that they might have hearts by which to understand?" Then he asks the logical question, why is the path not traveled so that a heart can be found? So that's the other take home today. God has no other, He doesn't want anything from you but to empty your heart. And the second one is, why don't you follow the path so that you can find that heart? How many different times? Is it bad?
No, not bad. It's nice. Nice, yeah.
Nice. Okay. Okay. Can I share one more passage with you?
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. Just one more. Actually, I only have one more. Look at that. All right. Hey, that's pretty good. Okay. So, again, this is my favorite one actually. It's always like that with him. It's always like, all right. This is on the very top of page 119. This one doesn't even really need an explanation, but we'll read it. What kind of knowledge do the heavens have of God that they can bear Him? The heavens can't bear God. And what kind of proximity does the earth have with God that it can be His abode? The earth can't contain the divine presence. The heart of the believer is at once God's intimate, His lover, and the abode of His mysteries. So that's where, if you want to know where God is, you look at the heart. Elsewhere he speaks about the heart, especially the realized person, as being the looking place of God. Right? He's looking all the time at our hearts, wants to see, if he sees himself in there or does he see us. The empty heart, he sees himself. The heart that's full of the dross of duality and otherness pushes God away. Now, I think that I pretty much have said what I wanted to say. And maybe we have some time for a couple of questions or discussion. Yeah?
So, by emptying the heart, is it emptying the mind first to reach to the heart, or how does that work?
Well, it depends on what you mean by the mind. Like
the intellect and the thoughts,
yeah.
The meditation that you
Yeah.
mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I think so. If you mean like the monkey mind, what they call the monkey mind, that one that's the partial intelligence, the one that's always jumping from concept to concept. Yeah, that part, that has to become still. Right? There's a beautiful image in Taoism of just this. They say, the Taoist sages say that if there's a lake, and then the moon, if it shines on the lake, the image of the moon will not reflect properly if the lake has, if there's ripples in it. Right? If you throw a rock in the lake, the image of the moon will kind of like look like that, right? So the pond has to become still. Once it becomes still, then the image of the moon will directly reflect upon it in the way that it should. It's just like that. So yeah, one does have to still that mind. And the problem with the world that we live in today, unlike any other time in human civilization, is that we have access to so many kinds of knowledge today. And all of it seems pretty useful. Like if you go to Wikipedia, you just get lost on good Wikipedia entries, about a lot of things. But the difficulty with that is that eventually, you'll kind of have like an unrest in your being if you just read just facts all the time or read books. Like there's one author, I don't want to name him, but he wrote a book. It was about a great mystical figure, and it was a confused book, very confused. And when I read it, I thought to myself, this is all over the place, literally all over the place, and didn't really say what seemed so obvious. And then the beginning of the book, he says, well, I wrote this on the subway, and I was at Dunkin' Donuts, and I was like this intellectual, always walking around thinking, and just this kind of self-congratulating claptrap, really. And it kind of came out that way. I'm like, yeah, this is not unity anymore. It says you're stuck in multiplicity. So again, stilling the mind, brings one into a form of oneness. That's why if you go to a Buddhist temple, for example, often you'll see there's some kind of like a gentle, like some waterfall or some kind of flowing water that kind of is meant to help you clear out your thoughts, come from the city, just before you get inside the temple, to kind of go through that process of just emptying your mind out a little bit. So when you get there, then you're still again. Okay, so it's all about stillness of mind, for sure. Good question. Yes.
I have a question, but it's just a reflection that for for some reason kept reoccurring throughout your lecture. It made me think of energy, like frequencies. I think back to like a quote that Einstein had said that the medicine of the future will be energy. And so when you said water again, it made me think of it again, you know, that in the Quran and the zikr, and you know, there's literature out there that sometimes says that the different surahs, how, you know, each letters, like they heal in different ways, or they resonate, or the frequency that they emit, you know, has a different sort of causal impact or effect in the world. You know. So it was just interesting, like, kind of like, lately, personally, I've been experiencing certain things with harmonization and frequency, so it's kind of on my radar, but it's just interesting that, you know, maybe I mean, I don't know if the Sufis say anything about this, maybe you could talk about that in terms of resonance and sort of energy. And
all over the place.
It's probably all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely. This thing's all over the place too, actually. They're flying around everywhere. It's been kind of fun, actually. I actually won. At the end, I think I won. I mean, there's different, you know, what we call energy today. They have different terms, but you know, the word barakah comes very. I mean, it doesn't really come close. But if you were to come up with some term that seems to indicate, you know, what's going on, barakah, it's that one word. See, again, it's translated normally as blessing, and then that's not a bad translation. But it comes from a word in Arabic that has to do with growth, something that grows. That's when you're in a company of somebody or a group of people, and it's a Mubarak company. That's a company that's blessed because of the spiritual growth that's taking place, right? And then even to the point that, you know, even people who are not like believers will walk into places, you know, places where there's a lot of prayer, for example, things like this, and they literally will be like, there's something really different about this place. I'll tell you one story, and I think I'll end on this. I have a childhood friend, and he grew up, you know, his parents, they came from the revolution, and they were Marxists and atheists, and we grew up, you know, really close, and but he was always an atheist. And we'd debate about God and stuff, but I had no tools at that time. I was 13, and he would just be like, we came from monkeys, and I'd be like, no, we just argue about nothing, right? But that then became very sophisticated debate as time went on. He became like a very accomplished philosopher and all that kind of stuff. And one year, probably in his like late 20s, he was kind of having like a crisis, and then he said, you know, I'm going to leave Canada, I'm going to go live in Jeddah. So he went to live in Jeddah for 2 years, and he taught English at school. And one day, I don't know what overcame him, because there's no explanation for this, because it's not like I was like talking to him actively at that time. He said that it just occurred to him that, you know, he's like, he looked in the mirror one day, and he's like, hey, I'm brown, I got a big beard, I got an Iranian passport, I can go make Umrah. You know, I don't know why he would have thought that. Like, he doesn't believe it, really. He once told me, if you gave me a proof for the existence of God, I still wouldn't accept it. This is his own words. This person, he was a very rock-headed person. And so anyway, he made Umrah one day. He just did what he had to do. I don't even know if he did it properly, but he ended up in Makkah, and he liked it. Then he went to Medina. And a lot of people go to Medina, even if you have a really hard heart. You know, there's something distinctively about that place. Anyone who's been there knows the barakah there. It's overwhelming. And he says that he was standing in front of the Prophet's Roda, and then he ended up walking in front of the Prophet's tomb. That's known as the wajihah. You know, it's when you face the Prophet. It's the most amazing thing if you can have that opportunity. And he said he stood there. This is somebody who, like I said, rock-headed, atheist, and he said that he cried so badly. He cried and cried and cried and cried. And there's a man who came. He described it, maybe it was a Sufi, some old man, he said, you know, with a munawwar face, he described him as a luminous face, took him, comforted him, made him sat down, and then he wrote me like a postcard. And I still have that postcard, and his teardrops are actually on the postcard. It's like really beautiful. And I thought I'll save that one day for him, because he might need it. And so, I mean, there's no explanation for that other than the Barakah Muhammadiyya, they call it, the Muhammadan Barakah. Like, what was that? Because he didn't, like when he left, he went back to Jeddah, and he kind of went back to life, and then he's, back, this is now 15 years later or whatever, and he's still an atheist, more or less. He might have days where he might be a little bit of a theist, I think, but overall, I think he's an atheist. But for that moment, he wasn't, and whoever could really be when you're there. There's a saying amongst the early Arabs that those who saw the Prophet ﷺ would believe in him.